Whether you're watching on thisislittube.com or YouTube, this is Lit Sports Online, coming at you with yet another episode of mixed martial arts action. We got Pat on the table yet again, and we are specifically previewing UFC 232. It's the pay-per-view that has the Jones versus Gustafsson main event. This is Jones versus Gustafsson 2, the rematch. We'll start with the prelim card. And first, we want to talk about BJ Penn in a lightweight bout against Ryan Hall. I'm definitely very familiar with BJ Penn. I gotta be honest, don't really know this other guy so much. What can you tell me about him?
So Ryan Hall is a guy that came up through the jiu-jitsu circuit. He's just kind of a phenomenal submission artist. And he's a phenomenal grappler. And so that's actually what makes this fight so interesting to me. I think BJ Penn is definitely on the tail end of his career. I don't know how well advised it is for him to be fighting anymore. He's not looked so well in his last few fights. He's on like a 5 or 6 fight losing streak. But it is encouraging to see them give him this matchup because Ryan Hall's not a dude who's going to go out there and knock him out. We've seen him get knocked out in a few of his last few fights. But they're putting him up against a high-level grappler who doesn't have a very well-fleshed-out striking game. So it's kind of a good matchup for BJ. He's not going to take a lot of head trauma, but he's enough, still in his old age, he's in like his 40s, right? But he still is a good enough striker to test Ryan Hall on the feet, and if it becomes a grappling match, it'll be super interesting, because BJ is one of the best American grapplers of all time. He's the first American to get his black belt in jiu-jitsu. He's the first American to win, I think, the IBJJF or something like that, the Mundials or something, one of the big the world tournaments and the black belt division, and so it has the potential to turn into a really, really interesting jiu-jitsu and grappling match, and I'm really excited to see if it goes that way.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess we're expecting a lot of takedowns and perhaps some takedown defense going into deciding this one.
Yeah, we'll see. I think it's going to start out on the feet because I think Ryan Hall wants to test himself. BJ Penn has gotten outstricken, whatever the hell the word is, in his last few fights. So he might want to go out there and try to prove something and keep the fight standing and put Ryan Hall away. And we'll see. But I love the matchup between two legendary grapplers, and it has the potential to be really interesting if it does go to the floor. It'll be a fun fight to watch, I think.
All right, moving on. We got Kat Zingano against Megan Anderson, women's featherweight bout on the prelim card. What's your assessment of this matchup?
So this is an interesting matchup in the sense that it's just another matchup in the featherweight division, which there's not a lot of girls in the featherweight division right now. So far, the only two that are actually steadily in that division that are on the UFC roster that I'm aware of are Cyborg and Megan Anderson. Everybody else are bantamweights that are kind of going back and forth. And Kat Zingano is a big bantamweight, so I'm sure that this weight class is more comfortable for her as far as making the weights, being in shape, and not having to completely dehydrate herself a couple days before the fight. But I think Megan Anderson's a little bigger. Megan Anderson is a great striker. She has a real long striking game. Her last fight, we saw her lose a decision to Holly Holm, which is a pretty one-sided decision, but it was mostly based on the fact that Holly Holm was able to get inside and grapple Megan Anderson. And I think part of the reason that Holly Holm was able to do that is because she herself has such a good striking game. She's a multiple-time kickboxing and boxing world champion, so she's used to dealing with a long striking game and probably some bigger women with a longer reach, whereas Kat Zingano is not quite as well versed in that realm. Kat Zingano is a powerful striker in her own right. She's a big woman for the bantamweight division. She is going to be giving up some size to Megan Anderson, I think, for sure. And but she definitely has the takedown and the grappling advantage in this fight. She's a phenomenal wrestler, a phenomenal grappling artist, and I think that if she's able to get inside Megan Anderson's kind of inside that long range, that long kicking and boxing range that Megan Anderson wants to be at with her kickboxing pedigree, I think that as long as Kat Zingano can get in there, it's her fight to win. I think she'll do better in the clinch for sure, but a little bit better dirty boxing. She'll be able to get some takedowns, hopefully, for her sake, and get some ground and pound and either win via TKO or via submission.
Next up, we've got an interesting matchup in the heavyweight division with Andrei Arlovsky against Walt Harris.
So this is kind of your classic on the way up, on the way down kind of deal, right? Arlovsky is just a grizzled vet of the sport. I mean, you look at his nose and it's just chaos. It's curved like this. It's nuts. His face is just completely shattered from years and years of fighting, and I'm guessing he'll get it fixed eventually, but after his fighting career is over, and run into a dude like Walt Harris who hits hard is a good way to accelerate the end of your fight career. You know, it's like I said, it's a young, powerful guy versus a vet that has a resume that anybody would be jealous of and has a striking game that is well suited to almost any foe. So I really don't know what's going to happen. We've seen Andrei Arlovsky be kind of spotty lately. He shows up for one fight looking phenomenal. He shows up for the next fight and kind of gets handled. And it depends on which Arlovsky shows up, but either way this fight goes, I wouldn't be that surprised. And it'll be a good tell on where both guys are in their career. You know, if Walt Harris gets the win over Arlovsky, that's a big feather in your cap. It's a big name to have. It's a good step on your way up the ladder. But if Arlovsky starts losing to Walt Harris and guys around that level, then we're definitely looking at a fighter who's a couple fights away from his retirement and definitely on his way out the door.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's difficult to maintain consistency when you are aging and a grizzled vet. But for Walt Harris, I mean, is this a guy that is like relatively like just came into the UFC, or is he had a couple fights? Like, what do we know about him?
I'm not super familiar with him, but I know he's been in the UFC for a little while. It's definitely not his first fight. I know he hits hard. I mean, his got good stats and stuff. 38% significant strike landed, 3 significant strikes per minute. I mean, dude can bang, but he's just, like I said, he's on his way up. He hasn't been fighting a ton of huge fights. He's been on undercards for most of his career. I don't know a ton about him, but this is that kind of turning point. You beat Andrei Arlovsky, they're going to start giving you the younger, higher up guys. And same with Arlovsky. He loses to a Walt Harris. He's not facing the top of the division anymore, not having that same name value fight that he's used to.
Okay. So there you have it on that one. That does it for the prelims. So now we're going to move on to the main card. We'll start with a matchup between Chad Mendes and Alexander Volkanovski.
Yeah, I'll just quickly go over this one because I'm interested to see the return of Chad Mendes to the division and the rise of Volkanovski in the featherweight division. It's a fun division because you really don't know what's going to happen. There's a super dominant champion in I think it's TJ Dillashaw right now, unless I'm confusing featherweight and bantamweight, but no, I'm sorry. It's Max Holloway, who we saw have a phenomenal performance a few weeks ago, and so it's a rough top of the division in the sense that you got to go get to Max Holloway, but the rest of the division is so kind of close in the sense that Max has kind of cleared out most of the top the young top competitors on his way up, and so now we're seeing some of the older guys come back. Like Chad Mendes was out for a little while because he had a suspension due to a drug test for some unknown substance that he wasn't aware that he was taking. It was in a supplement or something like that, and so we're getting a lot of the guys who were at the top of the division a few years ago are coming back and winning some big fights against some of the younger guys like Volkanovski, and so it's interesting to see who's going to challenge Max Holloway next because there's not many big name fights in the division that people are kind of scrambling for him to fight. But fights like this where you have a well-known, super awesome fighter who's a super athletic guy, he's a great wrestler, has power in his hands, and Chad Mendes fighting a guy named Alexander Volkanovski, who's kind of a relative unknown, you're kind of looking at that changing of the guard. So it's either going to propel the guy who already has a big name into more current relevance and push him towards a title fight, or it's a huge notch in the belt for Volkanovski, and it could definitely springboard him towards the top of the division. That way he could start fighting those guys and Jeremy Stevens and even a Jose Aldo or an Ortega or somebody like that to get him into the title contention. So I don't know what's going to happen, but it's an interesting crossroads, and it's definitely going to be good for the division.
Okay, and then the next one I think you wanted to briefly touch on is Ilir Latifi and Corey Anderson. How do you see that one playing out?
It's kind of similar to the Mendez Volkanovski fight in the sense that it's one where Ilir Latifi got towards the top of the division. I think he lost like a number one contender fight a few years ago. Light heavyweight is a kind of thin division, but these are two guys that have been on the cusp of getting close to the top for a while, and so this one will be about to decide which one of them is going to be on their way up and which one of them is looking at a longer road. You know, Ilir Latifi has a little bit of power in his hands. He has some really good wrestling. He's a real short, stocky guy, so he's real kind of low center of gravity, like real powerful wrestling and double legs and single legs. And Corey Anderson's a powerful striker and a good wrestling in his own sense. And so this again is just going to be another fun matchup where I think we're going to see some good action, a little bit of mixing it up from Ilir Latifi for sure. And I think that it's like by the time this fight's over, we're going to know. Like, we're going to see one guy definitely on his way up to the top of the division to challenge your Uzdemirs and your Anthony Smiths and people like that to kind of flesh out the title picture. It's been kind of held up for a long time, and the Cormier-Jones, Gustafsson thing, like, it's kind of been the same 3 or 4 guys in title fights for the last few years, and John Jones has been in and out, so seeing a little more clarity to, like, the middle of the division with this fight will... it will be good for the division. I think it'll give it a little bit more excitement to see one guy in a better position.
Okay, and then next we had an interesting weight class here, the welterweights, with Carlos Condit and Michael Chiesa.
Yes.
Now I know you're pretty hyped about this fight, aren't you?
Yes, Carlos Condit is one of my favorite fighters. Former interim welterweight champion, beat Nick Diaz to take the interim belt. George St. Pierre came back from a hiatus. From an injury, I believe. Fought Carlos Condit. That's the hardest fight of his career. And Carlos Condit's just a super entertaining guy to watch in the ring. He's a nice guy outside the ring. He's a fun guy. And he's just about as well-rounded as they come. You know, he's great striking, decent power, great submission game. Just fun guy to watch. His highlight reel is awesome. I think he has like 28 finishes out of 30 fights or something like that. Dude is just... He's never in a boring fight. And he's fighting a guy in Michael Chiesa who is a former lightweight who's coming up a weight class to the welterweight division for the first time after getting sick of making the weight cut to 155. He decided that 170 is probably a better division for him. So we'll see how it goes. And Michael Chiesa is a guy who, again, is pretty well-rounded. His striking game isn't super powerful. He's not super quick. He's not the best striker, but his takedown game and his grappling game is really good. So I think like the balance between how effectively he uses his striking to get it to the realm where he's more comfortable, which is the clinch and grappling game, I think he's hitting a pretty good spot. You know, he's not going to outpoint guys on the feet most likely, but he's going to be able to stay in the game on the feet long enough to take the fight to the ground and try to get somebody into a wrestling match or a submission game like he wants them to be. But that is a dangerous game to play with Carlos Condit, who has multiple victories with submissions. So it's a really good kind of litmus test for where Condit is. He's had some trouble in his last few fights. His name value is enough that he's never that far from the top of the division, but when he's on a kind of a losing streak, it hurts anybody's career, no matter how good your name value is. So it's a good tell of where Condit is as far as fighting a really good fighter in Chiesa, even if he is coming up a weight class. And it's a good starting point for Chiesa in the weight class. If he's able to come up to welterweight and put away somebody like Carlos Condit, that's a huge statement for your first fight going up a weight class to beat a well-known guy and as talented of a guy as Carlos Condit. So it's a real interesting fight. One of my favorite fighters, another fighter's debut in the division, and I think it has a lot of implications, and it's an interesting one to be in the middle of the main card.
Moving on, we have the women's featherweight title bout, an interesting one as Amanda Nunes comes up a weight class to challenge Chris Cyborg. And, I mean, I guess you could say this is like a bout of who's the undisputed champion in a way, couldn't you? Yeah,
and a lot of people are saying, basically, after this fight's over, we're going to know who the greatest women's fighter of all time is. And that's not an unfair call to say. Because I think a lot of people look at it right now and say, well, Cyborg is. Because Cyborg is just demolished every person put in front of her. I think she has one loss on her record, and she's like 20-1 or something like that. And just bulldozes people. It's pretty crazy. And we've seen Amanda Nunes lose. We've seen her lose in the UFC. But we've also seen Amanda Nunes come in and put away two of the most respected women in MMA history in Miesha Tate and Ronda Rousey. Not only that, but then she came back and put away Raquel Pennington in her title defense, and has just been a phenomenal champion. And while we've seen her lose, she's also put in some of the most impressive performances in women's MMA. And so, after watching her take out two of the best women in the sport, seeing her go up the weight class to challenge a woman who can't find challengers in Cyborg. There's not a lot of women in her weight division in the UFC right now, and even the ones that can fight in her weight division, there's not a lot of women that want to fight Cyborg. She's just that scary. She just puts people away in violent fashion. She has unprecedented power, and she's a nightmare for anyone to fight. And Amanda Nunes has been asking for this, which is terrifying in its own right.
Well, I mean, hey, you need challengers, am I right?
Yeah, I mean, and when there's not a huge weight class for you to draw from, there's no bigger challenger for you to fight than the champion of the next closest weight class, especially somebody who's been as dominant in recent fights as Amanda Nunes. So seeing her go up to fight Cyborg is the first true women's super fight in MMA history. Two of the best women of all time, irrefutably, and they're fighting. They're both champions at the same time, and they're fighting to take one belt. It's just a super fun fight to watch, and I have no idea what's going to happen. I think it's Cyborg's just aggression and power and overwhelming fighting style versus Amanda Nunes. She has long strikes. She has a little bit of power of her own, probably not as much as Cyborg, but she's knocked out plenty of women in bantamweight. And she's a little quicker, has a little bit better footwork, and I think that she's big enough that the reach will be enough to keep her in striking range when Cyborg is able to land punches. Because what we've seen from Cyborg is when she fights these smaller women, she's able to hit them from a distance that the other women aren't able to handle. And so I think Amanda Nunes is actually going to be able to handle the range that Cyborg fights at. So it should be a really interesting fight. I have no idea what's going to happen, but I'm very excited.
That brings us to the main event, the light heavyweight title bout between Jon Jones and Alexander Gustafsson. And I don't know if we mentioned this at the beginning, but there was a bit of a drug issue going on with Jon Jones, but the fight's still going to go on. So could we perhaps elaborate on that point before we really get into the analytics of the fight here?
Yeah, for sure. Jeff Nowitzki and USADA have been drug testing Jones, and they had a bunch of clean tests, and then they had one test come up positive for the same thing that he came up positive for, 17, 18 months ago. And so the question is it indicative of him taking that drug again since then, or is it an indication that there's still something in his system from 18 months ago? So most people, when they hear this, immediately just go, no, there's no way there's anything left in his body from 18 months ago. There's a half-life of 16 hours for oral turinabol and all this stuff. And I listened to the part of the Jeff Nowitzki podcast with Joe Rogan, and he's saying that there are, when your body ingests something like that, it breaks it down into multiple chemicals. And so what they're actually finding is not the actual chemical of the oral turinabol, but they're finding one of the metabolites that is a result that the body produces to handle what's in the turinabol. And there are some that are detectable in a short-range term, in a medium-range term, and a long-range term, and we're only seeing the long-range ones, and it's a result of some sort of pulsing effect in the body's handling of this thing. I don't know. I don't know what to make of it. I don't know whether to believe him and the UFC, whether to just go with my gut and just go, dude, the dude tested positive again. You know, we haven't seen other fighters take a drug test and then come off suspension twice, and then fail a drug test for the same thing 2 years earlier, and say that that's the case. We haven't seen that before.
Right. Well, so it is possible that some of these substances go in your system for a long time, but I guess the question is, like you said, he had several tests that were clean, right?
Yes. And so that was the first thing I thought too. I'm like, okay, so how do you go from having a bunch of clean tests and then a dirty test? And they're like, well, it's due to this pulsing that we've seen in one study before, and it's stored in fat cells surrounding the major organs and other muscle fibers, and occasionally it gets let out, and it could be due to the weight cut and the fact that during the weight cut you're breaking down different cells and a whole bunch. But to me, like, there's so many people that don't have problems with drug testing, and this dude has so many problems with drug testing, and you have to eventually just go, what? Like, are we really going to keep trying to make up excuses, right? And like, the other thing they're saying is it's such a small level of that substance that it wouldn't, such a small amount being in his system would not indicate that he had taken anything like that recently. And I get that, but like I said, like, we have a whole roster of fighters who never have problems with this. We have this one guy who just cannot not, like, he just is not passing drug tests for some stupid reason. And it's crazy to me.
So, perhaps a tarnishing on the legacy of a John Jones, would you say?
I would think so. I mean, for me it is. I mean, maybe not for the casual fan who's just going to read the few headlines and whatever people put out and pick their, news sources based on whatever they want to hear or want to do or whatever. But for people who actually follow the sport, like, I look at it and I go, dude, he's had like 3 or 4 different fights that he's failed a drug test immediately after or immediately before. And to me, that does, it is tarnishing, especially for somebody who's like one of the greatest of all time. And so you have to wonder if at some point you have to go, okay, if he had performance enhancing drugs in his system, he's the greatest of all time. Like, how much of that is the drugs, right? Which is the same thing that he picks on in interviews and media days and all that stuff on other fighters. Is like, you guys have actually convinced yourselves that the only reason I beat you is these drugs. That's hilarious. That means I'm going to beat you again because it was never the drugs and all this stuff. But I mean, it's just so much around his career. Like, he couldn't he couldn't behave himself. He couldn't not get drunk and drive cars. He'd gotten multiple car accidents and hit a lady and broke her arm and abandoned the scene and tested positive for so like, first he was like trying to be this holier than thou, like, complete good guy, but he was partying his ass off the whole time. And then he tests up positive for dick pills. Like, so now he's still doing the holier than thou thing, but he's taking, Viagra and going to the club and hooking up with random chicks, and then he's comes back and then he tests positive for PEDs multiple times. So, like, eventually it's like, okay, is he the best fighter that we've ever seen? Probably. Is he the greatest fighter or the greatest champion or the greatest athlete the sport has produced? No, I don't think so, because his accomplishments don't merit that. There's a certain level of achievement and kind of professionalism that you want to see out of those highest tier guys, and he just doesn't have that, in my opinion. That being said, like, his performances have been phenomenal. So is he the best fighter of all time? Probably, yeah. If he cleans his act up and just goes on a tear and takes out the next couple guys at light heavyweight and then moves up to heavyweight, will he be the greatest of all time? Yeah, for sure. I mean, and does he have it in him? Yes. If he keeps failing drug tests, will he be remembered that way? Absolutely not. It's crazy to me that he just keeps having problems when we have a full roster of people that don't have these issues. And, like, he can make all the excuses he wants, and people around him can, but it just looks bad,
Yeah, so as far as getting into the fight, though, with Alexander Gustafsson, I mean, so obviously this is like a rematch, right?
Yes.
It's like it's the second one they're doing. So, well, what can we take away from, like, their first match that could maybe I mean, does that carry any weight for the second match?
I think it does and it doesn't. So the couple things we saw in the first fight, I think Gustafsson, fresh and at range, will beat John Jones from what we saw in the first fight. If they keep it at a long distance range of kicking and boxing, Gustafsson's boxing and his footwork and his movement are enough to keep John Jones kind of bewildered and not be able to land his big shots. Because John Jones isn't the best at throwing quick combinations, but that's exactly what Gustafsson is really good at. So Gustafsson was, in the first fight, was able to kind of time kicks from John Jones, and he was able to step inside and land a few punches and get out real quick and cut angles and land punches. And John Jones wasn't having much success because he tends to throw single kind of pot shots. And so I think that Gustafsson has the advantage in that distance. Thing is that we've seen Jones have some success at that distance before against other fighters. Typically fighters who didn't have the reach that Gustafsson does and didn't have any sort of comparable range in their punches. But we've seen him have success at that range, you know, earlier in his career against Shogun, against Rashad, against Rampage, against a bunch of guys. So Jones has the capability of being successful at that range against anybody in the world. I just think that Gus has a little bit of advantage, and I think that's his biggest advantage, is at range, is if he's able to keep the fight at punching, you know, long punching and kicking range. I think that's where he is going to have the most control, the most success. But I don't know if it's going to be as easy to keep it at that range as it was in the first fight. So I think one of the things that happened in the first fight is Jones claims he didn't train that hard and all this stuff. So I think that he wasn't as prepared as he should have been, and I think it showed in the first few rounds, where the first 3 rounds, I think, were mainly Gustafsson. The first 2 rounds for sure. The third round was the closest out of the 3. And then we saw Jones kind of take over from about the last minute and a half, 2 minutes of the fourth round to the end of the fight. And I think that Jones eventually just figured out what he needed to do, and that's what Jones needs to do in this fight, is get inside that long punching range. John Jones has become a phenomenal fighter in the dirty boxing and infighting range. He has great elbows. He even likes to use his elbows at range, where he stands at punching range, grabs somebody's hand, and steps in with a big elbow, which is one of the things that we saw him have a little bit of success with in the Gustafsson fight. And one of his favorite techniques was the most significant strike of the entire fight. He likes to throw a spinning back elbow off of an opponent's like big right hand, right? So Gustafsson threw a punch and went to duck under something, and Jones threw a spinning back elbow that landed right on Gustafsson's forehead, and it like basically just compressed his whole spine. It was the turning point in the fight in the fourth round, for sure. After that, Gustafsson did not look the same, and I think that single strike changed the entire dynamic of the fight and won John Jones the fight. But it took him a while to figure that out. So now that we're going into the rematch, I think that Jones already has an idea of what will work against Gustafsson. When Gustafsson is able to get it, John Jones does have a longer reach, but when Gustafsson is able to land those long strikes, he still has to step in close, especially to get a little bit of power on him. So Gustafsson was able to slip punches and counter John Jones' strikes, but in order to do that, he had to step inside that punching range, so he had to get a little closer. So eventually what John started doing was throwing those elbows that he likes to throw a lot. He likes to throw like a stepping elbow instead of it looks like he's going to throw like a hook or an overhand right, but instead he folds his arm and throws the elbow. And we saw him do that in I think the first time I saw it was the second or third round, and we saw him have some success with that in the fourth and fifth rounds. And so I think that now that he kind of knows that range that he needs to fight in, he can't stand at that long range and try to punch with Gustafsson. But if he gets inside of him and can throw those big elbows and initiate a clinch game, I think he'll be more successful. In the first fight, we didn't see Jones get a lot of takedowns. I think he got one takedown the whole fight. Gustafsson got a takedown of his own, but we saw John Jones realizing he was getting outpointed on the feet and then going for a takedown to just change where the fight was happening so that he could kind of get the upper hand. He was not able to take Gus down. And so I think that will be an interesting point or an interesting dynamic in the fight, is whether or not we see John Jones, which I think we may, because John Jones likes to go into fights and beat people either at their own strength or doing something that people thought he wouldn't do against that opponent. So I think that the fact that he couldn't get the takedown in the first fight, he's going to want to go out there and prove, well, I can take this guy down. I can take him down whenever I want. I can control him. So I think we might see Jon Jones try to do that in this fight. I think we're going to see him try to strike at range with Gus, and I think we're going to see him try to force takedowns just to prove that he is better in the places that he got beat before. I think he wants to prove to the fans and to his naysayers that not only because he's fighting for more than just the win. He's fighting to erase the controversy. He wants to show not only is he more than the drug test and all this shit that happened beforehand, but he is better than he was, so much so than that first fight, that he is able to actually control and dominate the positions where he got beat in the last fight.
Now, would you consider these guys to both be like stand-up fighters, or a little more well-rounded than that? Like if you had to describe what they're trying to do typically.
So I would say Gustafsson's a stand-up fighter. Yes, I think he was a boxer when he was younger. I think he has an amateur boxing background where he beat the Swedish national champion, and he's definitely a stand-up fighter. He has some phenomenal knockouts. I think Jones is the most well-rounded fighter we've ever seen. I think we've seen him get finishes, it's striking. We've seen him on head kick knockouts. We've seen him pummel people in the clinch with knees. We've seen him choke people out standing up from the clinch. We've seen him take people down and pound them into the ground. We've seen him take people down and submit them. Jon Jones can do it all. You can't just classify Jon Jones as just one of those things. I mean, he's just so well-rounded that you just have to acknowledge, like, yes, and I think that's part of what makes him so good in every individual realm, is not necessarily that, like, if you put him in a kickboxing match, he might not beat Alexander Gustafsson. But in an MMA fight, it balances out because Gustafsson is going to be more hesitant to do what he would do in a straight-up stand-up kickboxing fight because of the fact that if he opens himself up, Jones can get in and get that clinch or get in for the takedown.
Right, but it sounds like the key to Gustafsson doing well in this fight is, it sounds like he needs to be a little more conservative, right? Lay back, have range, have the takedown defense going strong. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like he's not, like, for him to win, he can't be super aggressive with Jon Jones, is what it sounded like to me.
To an extent, it could go very wrong. If he gets aggressive and Jon Jones is able to counter him and time those takedowns well enough to get him down, then it could be very bad. But in the first fight, we saw Gustafsson be pretty aggressive with his striking and kind of forcing the action to an extent, and just able to fend off those takedowns. So if Gus's takedown defense still holds up, then I think that we could see him go out there and just be aggressive and make Jon Jones fight off his back foot, because they both like to move forward. Neither of these guys likes to be the one against the cage backing up, and I think that whichever one is able to control the striking range well enough to make the other back up will have more success in that range, and I think that will determine how the fight goes. And because if Jon Jones starts to get beating up at range, he's gonna go in for clinch engagements or takedowns that he wouldn't normally go for. If he had a choice of when he would attack for it, he might throw a combination and then with a takedown. Whereas if Gus starts beating him up on the outside, he might just go for a takedown just to not get hit anymore for a second, just to kind of stop the fight in its tracks. So I think that range will for sure determine what happens in the fight. And I think that if the same thing happens as before, where we see Gustafsson come out and kind of take control of that range early, we've seen him get a couple knockouts recently. If he starts taking over that range and just gets super aggressive and puts it on, we could see him start to take control of the fight and put Jon Jones out of there. It's not out of the realm of possibilities at all. But Jon Jones is a king of adaptation and doesn't get like flustered to the point where he makes really poor decisions in his fights. So even if he does start losing at that range, I think he'll adjust pretty easily with throwing his lunging elbows and things. So I don't know. That range is the deciding factor for the fight, though. If Jon Jones is able to mitigate Gustafsson's effectiveness at the long striking range, then I think we're going to see a bad night for Alexander Gustafsson.
So there you have it, UFC 232 preview in the books here on Lit Sports Online. And stay tuned for next time. Watch on thisislitTube.com or on YouTube. Stay tuned. That's the pay-per-view card, UFC 223.
232.
Fuck. We might want to reshoot the ending part, Alex. So that does it. UFC 232 action. Was that right?
Yes.
Redo it again.
Jesus Christ. All right,
Just leave it.
rolling, ending. Rolling in 5, 4, 3.
So that does it for this pay-per-view preview, UFC 233.
Dude, it's right there.
Fucked it up again.